Hi everybody, just making a video for us here in week number one, session number one. And really the video is going to have two components, and this is something you can expect when I make the videos. One, I'm going to try and engage with some of your comments in terms of the forum to highlight some of um, the relevant parts that I think that relate back to our texts in terms of the class. And I'm also going to make comments on the texts themselves. So some things that are important to flag, theoretically, that, we'll see again, or things that are going to be influential in terms of your success for your assignments in terms of the class. So hopefully tonight, actually in just a few minutes as I make this, I'll meet a few of you on life size. So I look forward to that. Always enjoy meeting you and getting to know you a little bit better. I've been going through the forums and responding to introductions and the first forum post, and I'll continue to do that as people participate in the forums as well. You'll see my comments scattered about, and usually what I try and do is dedicate about a half an hour each day just to the forums to respond and engage with questions for people, or talk about some of the relevant things that you're bringing to the fore. So that's what to expect. So I'll get started a little bit with some of your comments early on here in terms of the defining adult education post. And this is something that's really important, because the ways in which we define adult education will start to crop up in a number of different areas, and it'll also help you to identify where your own priorities are. So when you're facilitating, when you're teaching, thinking about what it is that you want to emphasize in terms of definitions. And so I went through the forum and I highlighted four kinds of themes that were either common or important. And so I'll just start. Jeff, I noticed that you had talked a little bit about motivation, thinking about adults and internal motivation. And this is a very common thing. And I noted that, Melissa, you talked about it as well. Early on in the history of adult education, one of the characteristics that was really emphasized was that of internal motivation, that adults are motivated unto themselves as kind of autonomous subjects to want to better or achieve something. And so this is actually, the question of motivation isn't just about encouraging people to participate, but often it's framed as one of the defining characteristics. So thinking about what it is we're motivated, how we're motivated, and there's a subsequent debate around this as well when we talk about motivation, if we can actually have internal motivation. So people will often say, a lot of the literature will say that adults are motivated for themselves to better. And some critics of this discourse have said as well, look, is it ever really internal? We don't live in an isolated world. We live in a very social world by nature of humanness. And given that, can we ever really say, to what extent are we ourselves motivating versus the other factors, the systems of rewards and punishments that we engage with in the world? So that's something to highlight and to think about, the question of motivation, as a couple of you brought up in terms of that. Alexandra, I noticed that you hinted on an aspect that a number of other people did as well, and that's about age, right? And I commented on I believe it was your post when age came up, is that Andre Grace, a scholar in the field, has often commented that the term adult is a very new concept in human history. We didn't think this way 200 or 300 years ago. You'd kind of be born, forced into work in your teenage years, and that category of teenage years is also much newer. And then you die, right? And so this is actually a very, very recent thing in terms of human consciousness, right? We just did not have people thinking about development in the same way that we do now, right? A lot of times it was there were a lot of our existence hinged upon religious definitions, right? And sometimes it does now as well. But all this to say, the aspect that we would have an extended period where we're more or less physically developed, how does that play into educational opportunities? And also, what does it mean? Some of you will go on and take an elective called gerogogy. talking about third age learners. What does it mean when we reach an age that is well advanced compared to 400 or 500 years ago? So thinking about the age question as well, this ties in to the some of the things that people talked about, maturity, right? We have very mature youth. We have very mature adults. I might be one of those. I don't know. All this to say again, the age question in terms of definition. How much do we want to hinge our definitions upon that? And what does it mean when we talk about teaching groups of people or learning with groups of people who are not youth? I'll put it that way. One of the other things that came up in terms of the Defining Adult Education forum posts, Bria, you talked a little bit about, and you'll see this reflected in the writing, the question of the society versus the individual. We live in, you'll see a lot of talk in the readings and in adult education about, or in education in general, I will say, what liberal philosophies of education are. And what's really important to note about this, anytime you see the word liberal philosophies of education, it doesn't mean left or right politics. We have a Liberal Party in Canada and provincially as well. But the term liberalism in this sense does not relate at this moment in time to left or right politics. You can have liberals on either side. What liberalism really means is the emphasis on the individual. And so a lot of adult educators in Canada and Britain as well have, especially when you look at those radical or critical traditions, question how much emphasis we can put on the individual, right? Given that we live in a complex social and cultural state. And so if you look at developmentalists, they'll often define society as living together and cultural as shared meaning. So there will also, people like Michael Tomasello will differentiate that animals will live socially in many cases, they'll live together, but they don't have cultural tools. That means they can pass on across generations messages and meanings. And so given that the fact that humans are social and cultural animals, how much can we attribute to the individual? How much do we have to account for in terms of societal and cultural pressures? And this relates back to Peter Jarvis's discussion about structures, and you'll see this as well in the first two chapters of the text when they talk about structure and agency. This is what sociologists call the debate about structure and agency. How much do we understand as the things, the tools that are handed down to us? None of us, and for example, none of us created English, right? We all had to learn and participate with others in learning and speaking English, right? But we also have a certain amount of agency. I can make a new word, right? It might not mean anything to anybody else, but conceivably I could. I'm not going to attempt to here today. So when we talk about adult education and think about the structure and agency debate, how much do we emphasize societal pressures, what we're born into? And in the second chapter, they talk about Marx's influence and neo-Marxists on adult education. Marx has a very interesting line, which is essentially, we create the world, but not of our own choosing. And Marxists tend to kind of come down in between structure and agency, and postmodernists, which I'll get to in a second, they'll tend to privilege structure, and the liberal aspects of education emphasizes the individual, right? So this is a really important definition as well, and you'll encounter this multiple times as you work your way through the program. This question of structure and agency, and it's also good to ask yourself when you're reading research, who does it privilege, right? Where is the center of action? Who are the agents involved in decision making, in pedagogical decisions? All of these types of questions are very good. I'll move and shift a little bit here and talk a little bit about some of the key concepts that I can absolutely guarantee you're going to see again in this class, and you're going to see again across the course of your program. So first of all, in Chapter 1, and Bruce Spencer and Elizabeth Lang's book, they talk, and I will highlight this, about the the spectrum of formal, non-formal, and informal education. So formal education, I think, is fairly clear. Those are the institutions where you get a credential. That it's the purpose is to credentialize people in terms of education. An example, Brock University, right? Any university is going to be have formal educational programs. Non-formal, those are the ones that are still organized but don't necessarily credential. And so one of the good examples of this is perhaps, if you were to go to the Y to take a swimming class, you might complete the swimming class and maybe not get a credential. If anyone's teaching swimming at the Y and they say no, you actually get a credential, I take it all back. But I'm assuming that this example still holds, that you're participating in a group. However, the mandate and the mission of the organization is not to educate, but it actually does provide that service. And finally, the broadest category, and for me, I think one of the more intriguing ones as well, because there's a lot of nuances to it, is the informal aspect. And so a lot of people will talk about it as informal learning. Donovan Plum, for example, he likes to give the example, informal learning. How did you learn to balance yourself to walk up a hill? Right? How do we learn to navigate our world? How do we find our way and participate in certain customs and traditions? So, for example, I'm wearing a jacket. One of my favorite jokes from Gillian Garve's History of Punk Music is about Iggy Pop, who finds his way in terms of finds his way in prison one day for drunken disorderly conduct. And he calls his friend Ray Manzarek from The Doors. He's a keyboardist from The Doors. And Ray Manzarek comes and says to bail him out the next morning and sees him in a dress. And he says, Jim, Iggy Pop's real name is Jim, why are you wearing a woman's dress? And Iggy Pop turns to Ray Manzarek and says, Ray, this is a man's dress, right? And the joke is, of course, that he assumed that women wear dresses because in Western cultures, that's the assumption. And when I first heard the story, read the joke in the book, I never thought too much about Ray Manzarek's question. But this is the part about informal learning. How do we learn the customs and traditions that we take for granted? Right? And so the reason I find this most interesting is that it offers us pause to be able to say, what is it that we do take for granted? And Michael Welton, who is a historian of adult education, he says the task of adult education is to question our grasp of the obvious. This is a phrase that Welton and Plum write. And he said we have to question our grasp of the obvious. And the problem is not with our questioning abilities, but it's what's obvious, right? Why is it we have to pay taxes? Now, I'm not advocating everyone stop paying taxes. I think there's a good logic as to why, but it's these types of questions that we have to ask ourselves. And that really is, in terms of Welton and Plum, for example, where they say adult education needs to be. We have to be asking those questions about what is obvious. Why do we do this? Why is it a woman's dress and not just a dress? And in the end, if we come up and we say, no, look, the things we've assumed, the things that we've taken as obvious, are there for good reasons, that's fine. We continue on with our lives. But we still need to ask those questions. And so the informal aspect, the broadest aspect of learning how we live our lives on a day-to-day basis. In the text as well, they talk a little bit about state support, and I want to just take a minute or two and talk about adult education in Canada and state support. If you go back to the founding of Canada, there was an initial document. They used to call it the British North American Act. And what it did early on, the provinces were most of you will know this, the provinces were very concerned that they would lose power, lose autonomy. It would become centralized. Specifically, my home province, Nova Scotia, didn't want poorer provinces such as Ontario at the time taking a lot of their resources. So they enshrined certain responsibilities. And the British North American Act, I believe now it's referred to as the Constitution Act, defined those responsibilities. So this is why you have federal and provincial responsibilities. Provincially, education fell under each province's purview, and that remains true to this day, right? This is why you have an Ontario College of Teachers. If you're out of province, each province will have its own ministry, and they will regulate. However, at the time of Confederacy, adult education was really not on people's radar. It's a much more contemporary term, a much more contemporary concept. You'll see that when you do the history, and you'll start to unpack some of these things. That's not to say it didn't exist. It absolutely did. But the government was unconcerned with delegating this responsibility to provinces, and federally was not covered either. As a result, we have very few examples where adult education is taken up by the provinces, and we have very few examples where it's taken up federally. Some of you may argue, I do understand that we have a number of related things. HRSDC, which is, I think, changed its name by now, again, and a little bit dated. We used to have the Canadian Council of Learning. These are federal government initiatives, and you certainly have the provinces have some money in terms of adult education. But I think we all understand from our own experiences, nowhere near the K-12 system, right? Nowhere near the post-secondary education system of colleges or universities provincially. So the state support aspect is one that, you know, when we talk about adult education, has a real effect, because there has been some, I'll say, negligence in terms of funding and providing support for adult education. Also in the readings, one of the things that you'll see, and you'll see next week as well, talking about barriers. So next week we have an article as well detailing some of the barriers. And depending on where you fall, exactly where your interests are in adult education, this will vary, right? Many of you have articulated that you're working in workplaces, you know, electricians, firefighters, human resources. Some of you might be more interested in adult basic education as well, or community development education. And so when we talk about barriers, this one is highly contextualized. But one of the things that you'll see in terms of Canadian adult education research as well is a very keen critical lens on how race, class, gender play out in terms of access to education. And if you were to come into the undergrad teacher education program here, I know one of the books they give is Terry Witherspoon, and he has a great text talking about the gender imbalance in terms of pay and access to education. And this is often ignored. In Canada, across the board, we have a horrific pay inequity when we look at comparable positions for men and women. And so thinking about how this affects adult education and the systems of rewards that we give people that do pursue further education, extremely important, and we won't lose it. Sorry, should not lose sight of that important fact that we live in a very inequitable society. And likewise, when we talk about opportunities, thinking about race, racialization, very key for understanding, you know, how adults participate and who is willing to step forward to venture into adult education. And people like Jennifer Kelly have done a great amount of work in this. If you're interested in reading that, that's something we'll return to as well. The final thing that I want to highlight here tonight, too, is that when we talk about defining education, in Chapter 2, you'll see an extended discussion of the difference between essentially what's called andragogy and pedagogy. And so in the 80s, Malcolm Knowles was very concerned of adult education. Malcolm Knowles was very concerned that the term pedagogy was not sufficient to describe what happens when adults are engaged in teaching and learning. So he chose to go with the term andragogy as something that is unique to humans. And if you look in the text, you'll see some of the considerations there that many of you have already highlighted from your own experience as to what it is that makes adult learning unique, and to Knowles's point, perhaps deserving of a separate term, andragogy. What's interesting about this is, so previously to Knowles, not exclusively though, but previously, people would talk about pedagogy as terms of all teaching and learning relationships. And Malcolm Knowles really wanted to exert this aspect of andragogy that's unique. Teaching adults is something different than when we teach K-12 children. And there's a number of considerations that we have to have. Now, those considerations that you'll read about in the book, they have not gone away. What is interesting about this debate, though, Knowles wrote that in '84, but he was working on it before as well. Generally, the term andragogy has dissipated. The amount of people that use it, I myself actually don't use andragogy that much. I'll talk about pedagogy more than I will about andragogy. You might disagree with me. One of the things that I think is important when we think about teaching learning is about what is species specific, so how do humans learn, right? And then think about, what it is about adulthood that nuances this term. All this to say, the field has kind of moved away from andragogy, the term andragogy, not those considerations, as I say, but the calling it something specific. And so a lot of people, if you go to a conference now, you'll see a lot more discussion about pedagogy. In fact, now that I think about it, not a lot of times you'll hear people talk about andragogy. There is, however, one exception. And I realize this, although I wasn't the first to note this. In French, if you go to Quebec, if you go to University of Quebec à Montréal or the University of Montreal, they will still run programs in andragogy. They have maintained this term as important and worthwhile retaining. Why is that? Don't know, right? Taught in Montreal for a couple of years. I'm not exactly sure. It's an interesting phenomenon. So if you look at the English-speaking adult educators, much more often to talk about pedagogy. The French, however, still will talk about andragogy and spelled very similarly. So you'll notice, even if you're not a fluent French speaker, as I am not, you'll still see in French texts about adult education that they'll emphasize andragogy. So those are my thoughts on the readings, some of my thoughts on your post. As I say, I'll be still going on the forums, engaging with you. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm going to meet some of you here soon. And so as you venture forth into session 2, I hope that some of these comments help.